Hello, welcome to this new tutorial series in which we're going to deconstruct Arturia's Pigments synthesizer. Now this thing is a bit of a monster. It's basically the sum total of everything Arturia have learned about all of their classic synthesizer emulations of the past. I've done quite a lot of video series on them individually. They've taken all of that knowledge and basically put it all into one synthesizer. So this thing is a workhorse monster. When I say it's a synthesizer, it's really kind of 4 different types of synthesizer in one. And we can see that in the engine table. When you first load the default preset up, which I've loaded here, this is completely generic right out of the box. You've got a really simple sine wave. But what you're actually hearing there is the first entry in a wavetable synthesizer. Wavetable synthesis is a huge topic in its own right. We'll deal with all of this in this tutorial series. But you can see here that engine 1 is a wavetable. If I move this position knob, I'm going to turn this sine wave sound into a triangle. But I'm not going to just do it abruptly. I'm actually going to morph from one sound to another. Let's hear that. And this is the beauty of wavetable synthesizers. The more waves you put in your table, more options you have available to morph between them and get really interesting sound effects. And that's just an example with the simplest possible types of wave shapes. But if we get something a little bit more complex and we morph between those, we have the potential for some really interesting sounds. So that's wavetable synthesis. And don't worry, we're going to deal with all of this in great detail. Then we've got our classic analog synthesizer. This is your subtractive synthesizer that was prevalent in the 60s and 70s. And as you can see, we've got access to 3 different oscillators here. At the moment, we have our nasty sounding but very harmonically rich sawtooth. That's what we've got here. If I decrease the volume of that and bring in maybe a bit of triangle, we get a bit more interesting shape. Volume kind of thing, and maybe add a sine wave to it. And then we've got a composite of all of those 3 different sounds, and now we can filter it. Add a bit of resonance, and now we're starting to sound a bit more like the analog synthesizers of old. We'll get into all of that in detail. The third type of engine we've got is a sampler. So I've just left my filter on there. I'll just turn my filter off for a moment. So there's my grand piano sample. So it sounds abrupt and harsh because it doesn't have any of the layering that turn it into a piano. At the moment we're just hearing the raw sound of a sampled piano. We can go in and change it to, I don't know, a marimba. And we've got the ability to do lots of editing on these samples as well. Probably the most interesting thing from a sonic perspective that we can do in our sample page is enable a thing called Granular Synthesis, which is where we chop the sample up into loads of little time slices and we play multiple parts of it simultaneously using things called grains. And you can see these strobing white lights on the waveform. These are all the playheads playing different slices of time, and we can do all sorts of interesting stuff to affect these different grains and how they behave over time. Sounds more like pipes now. There's some really crazy sounds out of granular synthesizers. Sounds like glass bottles on fire. Much fun to be had there. And the fourth type of synthesizer that we have is called harmonic, which is really an additive synthesizer. So here we're taking individual sine waves and adding them all together to make a composite sound. I remember playing with a Kawai K5 in the late 80s, early 90s, which was literally, you had 256 sine waves, add them together to try to make something interesting. It was an absolute nightmare of an interface, but a really interesting concept. And that's what we get with our harmonic engine. So if I play a sound, all of these lines represent the different harmonics that are being generated, and we've got massive flexibility in how we actually process them. So we can pan the odd harmonics to the left and the even harmonics to the right, and we get all sorts of interesting processing abilities on these things. And again, I'm going to go into all of this in great depth. Additive synthesis is kind of technically the most superior because it perfectly replicates how nature makes sounds. Nature just uses simple sine waves and combinations of them, just that the processing required in order to genuinely model a real sound using this synthesis type is so overwhelming. We're just not quite there yet. So additive synthesis is kind of the future. So those are our four different primary synthesizer types. Then we've got a fully featured effects bank. So by default, our standard template actually has delay and reverb baked into the sound. So let's bring a bit of delay in, bit of reverb, and we'll figure out how the three effects banks work, and particularly the auxiliary send, basically like a standalone effects unit that you can pipe stuff into. Really complex routing possibilities open to us here. Then we have a sequencer and arpeggiator to play with. So the difference is basically the sequencer, you tell it what notes to play, and arpeggiator, you play lots of notes and then it figures out interesting stuff to do with them. That's the basic difference between them. So here we're having a look at the sequencer. So let's get it going. So I'm just holding a key down here on the keyboard. And we can mess with the octaves. How long each of the notes is. Whether we have slides in between the notes. Great fun to be had. So once we've got our primary engine up and running and we've decided on what our sound is going to be and what effects we're going to use, we've then got an absolute mass of modulation options, and the bottom half of the synthesizer is all about the modulation screen. Now this is going to be the subject of multiple episodes where we talk about modulation because it's really the heart of the synthesizer, but options are effectively limitless. You can map almost anything to anything. So if I want to, for instance, map my modulation wheel to some controls in the synthesizer, incredibly easy. I can just basically choose the control that I want to modulate, go slightly outside of it and stick some in. And now my modulation wheel is going to modulate this value. And you see it in real time, what the modulation wheel's current value currently is. Change the amount over which the modulation can apply, no problem at all. And as I turn the knob, you can see the modulation range vary according to where the knob currently set. Just really, really beautiful interface, really nice. If I change my mind and decide I don't want this tilt modulation, no problem, throw it away. But we can actually have any number of modulations to any different type of modulation type. So now my modulation wheel is going to affect 4 values all at once, and it's going to sound pretty worrying, I would imagine. Cool. That's just one of the many, many different types of modulations that are available to us, envelopes and LFOs, and we're going to deal with all of this stuff. Don't want to kind of blow your mind on episode 1, but it is a pretty deep beast to go at. So we're going to pull each of these functions to bits, one by one, really break them down, figure out how the synth works, and then at the end, put it all together again and have a look at some of the presets that use some of the cool stuff. Hope that sounds interesting to you. If it does, if you hit the subscribe button and notifications, then you'll get advised when each of the episodes comes out. And I'd really appreciate if you hit the like button. That helps me out with the YouTube stuff. I'll see you for the next episode. Thanks very much for watching.